So we'll go over mediation today. We're going to move into moderated mediation next week. And then for the final week, I thought we'd talk about GEE. Is that okay? Okay, good. All right, so just to review, last week we talked about dummy effect and contrast coding as a range of options for examining differences in slope effects at specific levels of a categorical predictor. Moderation is a three-variable relationship where the magnitude of the direction of the x to y relationship depends on a specified level of the moderator. So when we have a significant interaction term, this implies that a simple additive model with both the main effects is insufficient in explaining the relationships of interests, and that there may be something more like synergistic effects between the two variables, or canceling of effects between the two variables, or something along those lines. When we probe moderation effects, this involves plotting y for x at varying levels of w, and then we also test the significance of these simple slopes. So that's what it means to test the simple slopes. And we talked about options for probing moderation, but it can be done in a variety of ways. We did it via the Hayes macro, but you can do it in a series of regressions, like in the Aiken. I'm most familiar with it, is as described by Aiken and West, and also just with hand calculations. So any questions about last week? Did anyone run home and do some moderation on a Friday night? Did anyone try out the macros last week? No? Yes? What happened? Because you shared the example with us with the
smoking. Yeah. I found that heavy drinking days at baseline moderated the effective treatment. So people who, there's almost no effective treatment in the control condition, but in the treatment condition, when I looked, like the moderation graph basically showed that people with the highest level of heavy drinking days at baseline did worse, and there was a relationship between, as they had more heavy drinking days, they had fewer days of abstinence during treatment.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Because drinking severity can, sometimes it's people do better the more severe they are, and sometimes they do worse the more severe they are. Did you happen to run the residual plot again with the interaction term in the model?
No, actually that was in the email you and asked you how to do that using the process.
Okay, you just run it in a regular, go back to good old fashioned regression. Yeah, and then you can see if, because Rachel had this like kind of a bow of residuals on her plot, so it kind of looked like high and low were misspecified. High and low values were misspecified, so one would think that then you'll get a better spread with that addition. Good. All right, so you tried out the macro and it worked fine, and
the graph is really helpful for understanding what's going on.
Yeah. Good. Excellent. Yeah, piece of cake. Mediation analysis. So basically we're talking advanced regression. We're moving into three variable relationships. Moderation is one type of three variable relationship. Mediation is another type of three variable relationship. Right? So here we are thinking in terms of all or a portion of X's effect on Y as being explained by the mediator, or being transmitted. Transmitted is a better word, by the mediator. This could operate statistically in the same way as a confounding variable, right? And what that means is just that the presence of that second independent variable, the mediator, will reduce the relationship between X and Y, right? But the difference is that a confounder is not a step in a causal chain, but rather an alternative cause of the X and Y relationship. And this is typically the opposite, or this is different than a suppressor X2 variable, in which its presence will increase the relationship between X and Y. So when you've got a suppressor in the equation, it counterintuitively makes the X effect pop out more. And the word suppression is used because it's suppressing noise variance in the X1 variable. It's suppressing out or suppressing noise variance in the X1 variable, therefore allowing it to have a sort of cleaner prediction of Y. Okay? Yeah? So mediating variables or effects are also called intervening variable effects. Like I said, this is just potentially an alternative explanation for the X to Y relationship because we're really just talking about shared variance here. We're just talking about what is the more powerful predictor. And because of that, careful design and strong theory are really important. Because really mediation is just smoke and mirrors, right? We set up a model, we say this is a mediated effect, but we're really just talking about a series of correlations, okay? Of which the M correlation is larger than the X to Y correlation, okay? Does that make sense to everyone? So caution, proceed with caution. So to set up better models, we think about employing causal assumptions because I guess I would say causal criteria. So by constructing a mediator model, we're proposing that X causes M, which in turn causes Y. So this assumes no reverse causality. In terms of reverse causality, that's where the causal criteria of temporality becomes really important. So M will follow X and precede Y, right, as steps in a causal chain. So that's the ideal scenario where you have them measured in a lagged model. So you have separate time points for each of the three variables. I think there's a few criteria that we could think about for causality, and I'm going to talk about them in a moment. But if there are the two, I think that we really want to think about at the most or as much as possible would be temporality and specificity. And when we're talking about specificity, we're really just talking about have alternative explanations been ruled out. Right? And so we can never completely do this. But again, this is where theory is really important in including the right covariates in the mediation model. So controlling for those alternative explanations in the different steps of the causal chain. So a mediator that stands up to these criteria for causality becomes a mechanism. And a star is born, yay. So who works with mediation models? Who's currently working with them? And what can we hear the examples?
I look at the effects of attention regulation, mediating, learning mindfulness meditation on like some kind of dependent variable outcome, child problem behavior.
So you're looking at a treatment effect, right? Treatment effects, what's the mediator again?
Attention regulation.
Attention regulation, which then affects,
some kind of, the dependent variables shifts.
Can range, but.
Child problem behavior or pro-social skills, whatever.
All right, and so then when is the timing of the mediator? Like, so when do you measure it? Is it a post session? Is it a 3 months, 6 months?
Yeah, that's something I was hoping you could talk about. I've done it a couple different ways. I mean, ideally I have 3 time points. But one question I have is about we only have 2 time points and how to include a mediator, because I know some people do it, but there's that issue of temporality that the mediator is not measured at time 2. That's happening at the same time as your outcome.
Right.
And then controlling for baseline effects. So like how to incorporate. I usually do it structural equation modeling approach, but I'm curious how you think about it in terms of controlling for change, like a mediator change, and controlling for change in the outcome variable.
Which I would do both. So the model will include baseline of the DV and baseline of the mediator, for sure. What other examples?
I have the one that I sent you, my dissertation data. So it's cross-sectional.
Right.
And like I mentioned 2 weeks ago, what I'm looking at is experiential avoidance as a mediator between sustained attention and post-traumatic stress symptom severity.
Right.
And the issue that I'm running up against is that my mediator is highly correlated with my outcome.
Because it's potentially a symptom
right.
of PTSD.
Right, because it's avoidance, it has,
Right.
and it shares some variance in that I'm looking at the total PTSD score, which includes avoidance symptoms.
And so is it the exact same variable, meaning, say you have a subscale for the DV, which has, or, a set of subscales for the DV, which would be avoidance symptoms, re-experiencing, blah, 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 blah. So is the mediator that one subscale, or is it
No,
a
it's
different,
not.
it's sort of an alternative
It's an
measure of
alternative
that
measure.
process?
It's a different measure,
Uh-huh.
and obviously there are different questions that they're asking. The PTSD scale asks specifically about symptoms related to the event that I'm looking at. So the event is sexual victimization, whereas the experiential avoidance measure is more general, avoidance of distress that may
Mhm.
come up in a general. So it's more like a
It's like a state
rate.
coping
Right.
measure, yeah. And they're all measured at the same time point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a tough situation, right? If with that, sort of clarifying the clarification you've made in terms of the mediator being this sort of a measure of how you cope, versus the avoidance as
A symptom.
a symptom. Yeah, it's still pretty. I don't know if people have thoughts. It's tricky. So what is your reviewer telling you?
So first of all, I used the Barron and Kenny, and they were like, "No, that's fallen out of favor. You can't use Barron and Kenny stuff." So
Everyone's so
Bootstrapping.
mean to
So I'm
Barron
like-
and Kenny.
I felt so dumb. I'm like, I shouldn't have used Barron and Kenny. So that was one of the reasons why I was really interested in hearing how I could use bootstrapping. Like they said, you have to use Preacher and Hayes. Like that's what people use now.
Uh-huh.
Don't be dumb and use that. And basically, I think I need to make a stronger case as for, I can make a case for temporality because it's all measured in one time point, but make a stronger case in terms of the theory of why experiential avoidance proceeds, in this path that I'm analyzing, precedes EA, experiential avoidance.
Yeah.
And why look at it that way?
Yeah, that would be my position, of sort of arguing it both ways in terms of making the theoretical case and then being very explicit and clear about the limitation of them being concurrently measured.
Yeah.
And I guess one other thought I might have is if you have other mediators to add in to the model to see if maybe that gets at the specificity a little bit more. That might be another possibility, if you had other, say, coping processes that are different types of coping, different types of, say, maladaptive coping.
Would it make any sense, and in my head it's like, well, they're all correlated, right? And like you said, we're basically testing correlations, especially concurrently. But would it make sense for me to see if sustained attention, so instead of doing the experiential avoidance as a mediator, test sustained attention as a mediator and see if, would there
Is
be a
that
difference
the
there?
positive side of coping? Is that I don't know
So
that
it's
construct,
it's
so.
impaired sustained attention, so, making cognitive errors in terms of, forgetting things and,
Yeah.
those kinds of.
Yeah, I would say if it makes theoretical sense, certainly people have different opinions about multiple mediator models, but I'm of the opinion that multiple regression is better than simple regression, because you are ruling out alternative explanations. So, I mean, it's worth a try for sure. We're going to talk about that today. We'll talk about single and multiple mediation.
I'm thinking I might just take out the avoidance cluster in my PTSD measure and see what that looks like. Because right now, when I enter experiential avoidance, everything all of the variance is explained by that path.
Right.
By the AV, or the mediation path.
Yeah.
And it takes away all of the effect that sustained attention has on an outcome.
I mean, if that made sense to do, but it is an important constellation of symptoms, right?
Yeah.
Do other people have thoughts on this question? What about other examples, Ron? What kind of mediation are you dabbling with?
We often look at sort of distal things, either context or family characteristics and child outcomes, and then look at things like parenting as mediating processes or child sleep organization and things like that. So,
And whose methods are you using?
we'll do for simple things, just Barron and Kenny, McKinnon, and for more complicated things,
I see.
through structural equation model.
Right. Other examples?
Well,
Yeah.
I am assessing the mediation effect of immediate risk factors to suicide ideation in adolescence, and then the independent factors are more social variables as social support, family functioning, and negative events.
So a set of risk and protective factors.
Oh, I'm not dividing in terms of risk or protective, just in terms of distal risk factors and immediate risk factors. So the immediate risk factors are more internal and psychological, like psychopathology, hopelessness, internalizing and externalizing behavior,
Right.
as the mediators of the social environmental factors.
And they're existing social environmental factors, or historical, like trauma history or something.
No, I'm not. It's in a community sample, it's cross-sectional. The social environmentals are more related to negative life events, social support, and family dysfunction.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of concurrent mediators, I don't have like a really good answer. I think that if you survey the literature, it occurs in the literature. For many types of research, it's unavoidable, like in a lot of or difficult to avoid because of the resources, the constraints of the grant and the data collection procedures. So I think that my only recommendation would be, good theory, and a lot of sensitivity analysis in terms of moving, just adding in covariates, changing how you're measuring the DV, just kind of looking at it in a variety of ways to see how strong the relationships are and how the different kind of shared variances sort of operate. And then transparency would be the other recommendation, of just being very clear in the limitation section about the fact that this is essentially, a conceptualization, not necessarily reality.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the case that I'm trying to make. I mean,
Right.
I can't say that this is the mechanism,
Right.
or a causal mechanism, but it could be a potential. I mean, it's in my title. It's a potential mechanism.
Yeah, yeah. I think I would say that you don't abandon the endeavor for that reason. I mean, because you have to, you have the alternative is you're setting up some type of EMA study to really get, when it comes to etiology, it's a lot harder to get temporality. And so, is it like some type of EMA study where you're, having a lag of minutes or hours or days between, say, the mediator and the dependent variable. And then even so, is that really like theoretically what you think is happening? You know, so it's a lot to think about. So who's familiar with the Kasdan and Knock criteria for causality, which is really Hill's criteria for causality that Kasdan and Knock took and applied to child and adolescent psychiatric research, and at least in alcohol research or addictions research made a huge splash and everyone loves it. And Kasdan and Knock, Kasdan and Knock, Kasdan and Knock. So everyone familiar with this paper? Okay, so they took Hill's criteria for causality and applied it to mechanisms of behavior change. So we've talked about specificity, we've talked about temporality. Other criteria just have to do with association, they have to be related. The article talks about gradients, so a type of dose-response relationship, which may or may not be the case. You know, we know in terms of curvilinear relationships, so there are other types of relationships besides dose-response relationships, but that is one of the criterion. And consistency has to do with replication across like samples or contexts. Experiments has to do with ideally experimentally manipulating the IV to M relationship. You can also experimentally manipulate the M to DV relationship, but then you're talking about, you know, a series of studies that are sort of triangulating on validating a mechanism. Plausibility and coherence really just has to do with, does it fit with theory and does it fit with the literature. I put in the site for today is the Knock paper, which talks about the same Kasdan and Knock criteria. I put in the Preacher and Hayes 2008 paper, which really talks about indirect, which is the predecessor to the process macro. And then I put in something else that I read 2 days ago, but I don't remember what it was. But it was good. So there's actually there's actually a nice set of papers in there to really get your feet in there. Okay, so just other conceptual stuff. Unless X explains 100% of the variance and why it is useful to study mediation, because you're trying to understand more about how Y occurs, right? That's what we're really interested in. Measurement sensitivity is really important in this, though, because failed mediation is often just poor measurement, either insensitive measures or poor timing of measurements. I know in clinical research it's common to have, like, say, a 6-month mediator, of, like, say, self-efficacy. But that, is that really, like, theoretically, is that really what we think is transmitting the effect of treatment? No, we might think that a proximal change in self-efficacy, say from pre-treatment to post-session change, that sort of makes more theoretical sense as a mediator of subsequent follow-up outcomes. Does that make sense to everyone? Also, there's controversy around, do you have to have an XY relationship in order to test mediation? The thinking now is no. How that maps onto etiology, I'm not quite sure, but I know that in clinical research, it's very helpful to be able to think about it in terms of implementation success versus failure and theory success versus failure. So what that means is that if X fails to predict M in the context of clinical research, what you're talking about is that your treatment over your control didn't differentially impact your theorized mechanisms of change, say self-efficacy or coping skills or one of the mechanisms you have of your mindfulness? Attention regulation, exactly. So that would be implementation success or failure, versus the significance of the B path is theory success or failure? So is your mechanism predicting your outcome, right? And if it doesn't, then that's a failure of your theory, right? If you propose that attention regulation should affect these performance tasks or these different dependent variables, but maybe it doesn't. If you rule out that it's not your timing and it's not that you have an insensitive measure, then you then consider theoretical failure of the theory itself. Does that make sense? It's kind of what makes it makes mediation fun, all thinking about all this. Okay, so here's the beginning model, the total effect. Here's the mediation model. So when we think about it in terms of 3 regression models, we're talking about step 1, which is testing that x to y relationship, which is testing the total effect, right? In step 2, we test x to m. That's testing the A path of the mediation model. In step 3, we test the mediator to the outcome path controlling for the independent variable, and that's the B path, right? And then in step 4, which occurs in the same regression model as step 3, we are testing the x to y relationship. We're testing the direct effect. So I'm actually just going to show you this again in a more substantive way. In step 1, we're asking if the predictor affects the outcome. And we've talked about that not necessarily being necessary. In step 2, we're asking, does the predictor affect the mediator, right? That's our implementation success or failure. In step 3, we're ruling out that the mediator only affects the outcome via its relationship to the predictor, okay? And in step 4, we're asking whether the predictor affects the outcome primarily via its effect on the mediator, okay? And so in Barron, if we're doing Barron and Kenny, then total mediation is when the direct effect is equal to 0, right? So total mediation is when the presence of the mediator completely eliminates the effect of the independent variable. Partial mediation is when the direct effect is reduced, right? So when the coefficient and or significance are reduced in absolute value with the presence of the mediator in the model. Okay? Does that make sense? So that's your Barron and Kenny. So in terms of the mechanics, when we talk about the product of coefficients approach, we're talking about the product of coefficients of the A and B paths, right? And these are A and B paths tested in those Barron and Kenny equations, right? So the Barron and Kenny approach is a causal sort of set of sort of causal decisions. But in terms of testing mediation in a Barron and Kenny versus a product of coefficients, the regression models the path models are the same, okay? So the indirect effect is the product of the A and B path coefficients. The total effect is the sum of the direct and the indirect effects, right? The indirect effect is also the total effect minus the direct effect. And the direct effect is the total effect minus the indirect effect. So you can crunch the numbers a whole bunch of different ways and they all come out and make sense together, which is always nice. We can calculate an effect size for the mediated effect. And so to do this, you would multiply 100 times the proportion of the total effect variance accounted for by the indirect effect. People like this. This is a nice measure to be able to provide. The problem is that under certain conditions, you will get, say, negative variance. You will get greater than 100. You can get numbers that don't make sense. So it's certainly it's an intuitively appealing measure, but it does have problems in terms of its mathematical properties. In terms of testing the significance of the mediated effects, these are here as sort of historical. The formulas don't differ really substantively. They're all z-tests. They're all normal theory z-tests, right? So a normal theory z-test of the significance of the product of the A-B path coefficients, okay? So, the issue that McKinnon sort of illustrated and has also become a very popular article is that the A-B path, the product of the coefficients has a skewed distribution. So when you're testing when you're conducting a normal theory z-test on a skewed variable, you're reducing your power, okay? So McKinnon and others have come up with alternative ways to test the mediation hypotheses. So the first way, the original way, or we'll say the original way was perhaps the Barron and Kenny. The second original way was the Sobel test, which is a normal theory z-test. And then the new way, or one of the new ways, is the asymmetrical distribution for the product of the coefficients. So this is kind of looking it up in an old-fashioned table. So it's the same as as a normal theory table, except that it's a table that McKinnon and colleagues sort of derived based on this asymmetrical distribution. But you're still going to kind of look up, the path, the coefficient values, the alpha value, and find your significance. It's just based on a different distribution. Bootstrapping can also, so the asymmetrical distribution and bootstrapping in the McKinnon study came out as the best options for optimizing type 1 and type 2 error rates, so sort of balancing them both. So bootstrapping is, say, the fourth alternative for significance testing. Bootstrapping is a non-parametric procedure. It uses a specified number of resamples of the data that creates a distribution of A-B effects, right? So you're going to create a distribution of effects based on your data, right, with a sort of resample and replace type of function. And this is going to give you a 95 or 99% confidence interval. When the mean of the bootstrap A-B estimate, and you can get this all in the process macro, differs from the observed estimate of the A-B path, then you might have some bias. But the process macro will give you a percentile confidence interval and also a bias corrected confidence interval, which is really just going to adjust a little bit for n, and that's usually the situations where you would have that potential bias of that your average bootstrapped A-B path, A-B coefficient is much different or sort of substantively different than the observed in the sample. Does that make sense? Process automatically gives you both. Okay, so here's our example. This is actually this is the same treatment study. Oh, no, this is a different treatment study. Okay, actually, because I changed it, because there was sort of a little unsatisfying, the relationships of interest last week. This is a far more satisfying study. This is a study that this is from Suzanne Colby's data. This is a clinical trial for non-college heavy drinking young adults, so non-4-year college heavy drinking young adults. It's an MI condition in contrast to a relaxation control, so it's like a time-matched control condition. And the question is, do intermediate cognitive mechanisms transmit treatment effects, right? So that's the substantive mediation question that we're working with. So here's our process macro call. Remember, you call process, then you do your variable list. This is week 6 drinking, so these are short-term outcomes. Condition, which is MI versus REL. This is the contemplation ladder, so this is a measure of motivation. This is a post-session ladder, so this is a change in motivation from baseline to post-session, okay? Here's baseline ladder as a covariate, and baseline drinking as a covariate. Okay, so that's your full variable list. You specify your outcome variable, you specify your independent variable, condition, you specify your mediator, which is motivation, and then process will automatically treat anything else that's left over as a covariate. In terms of this total one, most of these you're not going to change because you want all of this information, but this gives you the total effect regression. This normal equals 1 gives you the Sobel test, right? So you can compare the Sobel test, which is going to be the most conservative, to the bootstrapping results, and asking for the bias corrected and percentile bootstrap confidence intervals. I think it's 95 is the default, but you can switch it to 99. This just gives you confidence intervals for the coefficients, and then this is specifying the model, because remember last week it was model 1, that was moderation. This week we're talking model 4, which is simple or multiple mediation. Okay?
Quick question.
Yeah.
So is the covariates entered at every regression model?
Yes.
Okay.
They are. So here's our output. We got model 4, so you're going to check your model first, and you can see that it has specified things as you requested. It gives you your sample size. Here's the A-path model, right? So we've got the R square, but what we're most interested in the A-path model is the effective condition, right? And it's just covarying. There's those covariates. But the effective condition says that MI is associated with close to a 2-point increase in motivation. Okay, so from baseline to post-session. So yay, that's really good. And then in terms of the B path, we're interested in motivation, right? The coefficient for motivation. So here, this is telling us that an increase in 1 point in motivation is associated with close to 1 less drink per week at week 6. So we've got nice strong effects, right? So that makes us feel good about the potential for mediation. This is just our total effect model. In this case, treatment did affect outcome. And then here we have the total, so that the MI is associated with 5 less drinks per week at week 6 in contrast to REL. And then this is just sort of a helpful exercise in the beginning in terms of just crunching all the numbers and seeing that they all work out together. Right? So the total effect of X on Y, which is we got from here. So the total effect equals the direct effect plus the indirect effect, which is the product of those two indirect effects, the A and the B path. You see here the negative 0.76 and 1.79. The direct effect of X on Y, so we've got the direct effect here equals the total effect minus the indirect effect, and that's what that product is right there, okay? The indirect effect of X on Y is the AB path, right, which is the total effect minus the direct effect, okay? And that's it. Makes sense though? In terms of just where the numbers came from and how they all operate together? Yeah. Okay, so motivation is, so here's our indirect effect test. Motivation is a partial mediator of MI efficacy over REL on drinking. This is because MI increases motivation, which reduces drinking. And if we were to crunch a mediated effect size, it's a 27% of the variance. So 27% of the variance in the relationship between treatment and outcome is explained by this mediated effect of increasing motivation, which is then changing subsequent drinking.
Is there a way to test the significance of the indirect effect, or is that?
Yeah, and so you can do it several ways, But one of which is that you have your confidence interval right here. So 0 is not lie within the confidence interval. You also have your standard error right here, which is used to run the z-test. So for the Sobel test, it's significant at a 0.02 level. Okay.
So reporting both makes a stronger argument that the confidence interval did not include 0 and so the test was significant? Or do you just choose a more conservative test?
I typically just report the bootstrap effects and really just use the Sobel test as a way to kind of sort of a conservative way to assess this, the strength of the mediated relationship. I mean, you want all the information to agree, and when the information doesn't agree, then it really calls into question whether or not you should. I guess whether or not you should consider it mediation if sort of one, if you have sort of a marginal mediated effect on one bootstrap confidence interval and not another, which can happen if you have weak mediation, or if you have a weak A or B path, you can start getting information that doesn't agree, and that's when you've got a quandary, because is it mediation, isn't it, is it worth publishing, isn't it, depends on how important the story is the story of failed mediation as important as a story of successful mediation. Okay, this is sequence mediation, right? So this is model 6, okay? So model 4, you could have had multiple mediators, but it's going to give you a concurrent mediation test, just like multiple regression, right? It's going to allow the mediators to fight against each other in terms of explaining the variance and outcome, just as it would in a multiple regression model. This is an example of that sort of setting up a theoretical model that says, okay, MI is going to predict reductions or predict increases in motivation, which predict changes in intentions to drinking, and changes in intentions in drinking then in fact change drinking behavior. Now that said, motivation and intentions to change drinking are measured concurrently, so that's important to keep in mind. So we're adding in intention to drink here. We've also added it in as a covariate, the baseline as a covariate. M, we've added in, now we have 2 mediators. All of this stuff is the same. Okay. So I had to sort of draw the little arrow. But the idea is that, okay, so say this arrow isn't here, then that's a multiple mediator model, and that's how the model's being tested. But when you've got a sequential mediation model, you're getting this, but you're also getting this, but you're also getting this. So you're getting that third model that's testing intentions as a mediator of the motivation to drinking relationship. Does that make sense? That's what makes it sequential.
Did you specify the arrow goes one way or the C prime? Or is that a bidirectional path?
In reality, it is probably a bidirectional path, but this model is setting it up as a single direction. Is motivation is changing intentions, and intentions are changing the behavioral
So
outcome.
the process call is specifying this model.
Yes, yeah. I had to draw that little arrow in though. But actually, I don't know what's in the book. I have like a giant folder of all the before like Hayes took the process documentation.
PDF that you have.
Yes, it's wonderful, and it's got like 76 models, and
Sure
you can just
does.
go through it, and yay. Okay, so here's the output. Again, the A path, right? So MI results, so we've got the increase in motivation, 2-point increase in motivation, 3.5 decrease in drinking intentions, right? So this is our second A path model here. Here's our B path, right? So this is with them, we're looking at them together. Motivation is non-significant with intentions in the model, Okay, so an increase in 1 point in intentions equals an increase in, actually it should be decrease. Increase in 0.25 drinks per week. Now, I'll have to think about how the intention measure is measured. My assumption was that it's intentions to change drinking, but maybe it's intentions to drink. It must be intentions to drink. So here's the total model here. And then this is just, again, where you could crunch around the numbers, but this is the part that we want to look at, right? Which is, here's the total effect. So if we're treating it as just a multiple mediator model, this gives us the confidence intervals for the total indirect effect as explained by these two mediators, okay? This, and here's the key, this is where I'm getting the information, right? This says indirect effect key. That's telling you what all these things are, right? So this is the model. This is the the test of this indirect effect. Wait, let me look at this again. Sorry, I'm getting messed up. The total isn't in the key. The total is both variables. Then independent 1 is patient ladder, right? Then independent 2 is ladder predicts intentions, predicts outcomes. So that's the sequential mediation model. And then indirect 3 is just the intentions model, okay? So from that, we can see that the total indirect effect is significant, right, here. The effect of motivation is not significant when you control for intentions, okay? The sequence model is significant, and intentions are significant, okay? So what do we conclude? The effect of MI, in contrast to REL, on week 6 drinking is partially mediated by increases in motivation, which reduce intentions to drink. No indirect effects are significantly different from each other. Now, where did I get that information? I got that information from these contrasts. These contrast tests perform some significance tests, probably a z-test, of the difference in the magnitude of the indirect effects of each mediator. Okay, so it answers the question: is the effect of motivation significantly different than the effect of intentions? Okay, these you have to have pretty strong effects to be able to get these to come out as significant, but they're there. It gives it to you. It gives you that information. The model of motivation alone does not hold when controlling for intentions. The model of intention alone does hold when controlling for motivation. So again, that's kind of a good example of like, okay, we're really talking about what is the more powerful predictor, yet we're setting up this model that says that there's these sequential relationships. So I've actually seen that I've run out of time, but that is the last slide. Any questions, I guess? Any questions? I know time is up. You can ask me after class. You can email me. Something that I also wanted to say is that when you start like poking around with process, you can definitely email me if you run into errors or if you run into weird things happening. I'm more than happy to respond to your process.